On today's show, we have Alex Gladstein, Chief Strategy Officer of the Human Rights Foundation. He has concurrently served as the Vice President of Strategy for the Oslo Freedom Forum since its inception in 2009. Alex's writing and views on dissidents and dictators have appeared on ABC, BBC World, CNN, The Daily Beast, Foreign Policy, The Guardian, NPR, Time, The Wall Street Journal. He has spoken about the Human Rights Foundation's work at the European Parliament, MIT, School of Visual Arts, and Stanford University. Before joining the Human Rights Foundation, he served as the foreign policy advisor in the British Parliament. Alex is magna cum laude graduate of Tufts University, where he majored in international relations and Middle Eastern studies. He currently lives in San Francisco. All right, Alex. So before we get into the Flash Drives for Freedom project, I wanted to know, can you tell me a little bit about North Korea's dictatorial regime relative to other dictatorships? Because I don't think people know how different it is, I guess, in North Korea than maybe like other places where there are dictators.
Sure. Thanks for having me on the podcast. I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
When it comes to North Korea, it is at the very far end of the spectrum of dictatorship. So you have all sorts of authoritarian regimes in today's world, ranging from Saudi Arabia to Russia to Ethiopia to Cuba to China. Authoritarianism is a very global phenomenon that unfortunately inhabits all different geographies and cultures and ethnicities. It is a pernicious virus on the planet Earth today. We are making headway, obviously. There are more democracies today than there were several hundred years ago, but dictatorships persist, and the very worst one is in North Korea. The reason it's different is because the regime has achieved a near total control of information. So over the last 7 decades, as the Kim dictatorship has built its tyranny, first with the founding dictator Kim Il-sung and then his son Kim Jong-il, and now his son Kim Jong-un, what the regime focused on was total control of information. Now, this was easier in the first 5 and 6 decades because there was no internet. They could have easy control over all newspapers, local forms of communication, films, that sort of thing. So propaganda was basically complete and total until the late 90s.
Yeah.
But as the regime started to falter after the Soviet Union fell, and as food and goods started coming into North Korea from China, once the public food distribution system collapsed, other things started trickling in too. So you had, for example, unauthorized and illicit Chinese material, South Korean material, and other types of foreign material coming in, whether they be TV shows or soap operas, movies, and things that people wanted to get their hands on. And there became a great thirst for this content as the new millennium started. And over the last 10 years especially, the thirst and demand for outside content has increased in a remarkable way.
Yeah, can you tell us a little bit about how it came about? Did this come about from the dissidents who have escaped North Korea to South Korea? And was it a recent idea to kind of smuggle in flash drives into North Korea?
Well, there's 2 types of people who are sending information. There are people who are literally just sending it in because it's making them a buck, right, in the black markets, which have really proliferated in the last 15 years, the point where most North Korean villages and areas and towns have a black market where people are buying and trading things from the outside world.
Yeah.
It really was driven by market forces, but at the same time, there are civil society groups founded by North Koreans who've escaped North Korea and who now live in freedom in South Korea.
Yeah.
And some of them, like the North Korean Strategy Center, focus on sending information in.
Okay.
So they're not just sending in soap operas.
Oh, I got
We're starting to see them send in, for example, the entire offline language, Korean language version of Wikipedia, which fits onto a thumb drive. Or you're seeing them send in documentary films about the fall of the communist regimes in various places or in revolutions in the Middle East. There is an increasing demand now for what they call sort of second-tier content and third-tier content. So first-tier content is basically just pop culture, music and movies. I mean, that's what has seeped in big time since the 90s and has become totally accessible for the average young North Korean. They've seen South Korean soap operas. They've heard outside music. This is like there's an awareness today that's being recorded and can be backed up by data, both from interviews with defectors and also interviews with people who are on the Chinese border. Second level content is like, for example, educational content about history and politics.
Okay.
Third level content would be, that's where you start getting a little risky, and that's okay now, strategies for change. So I think what we prefer to focus on are the first two levels.
Because it's high risk for the dissidents, right?
Yeah, I mean, look, obviously, like the penalty for having Titanic is not going to be as severe as the penalty for having How to Start a Revolution.
Right.
The first one, you can easily bribe your way out of that. The second one, you would need a much larger amount of money or cigarettes or liquor to bribe your way out of that, if at all. If at all. Possible.
I wanted to ask you this, because I was thinking about the concept and how it'd be smuggled into North Korea. But do most North Koreans have the technology to play the thumb drives? So, I mean, I'm thinking that, the vast majority of people don't have computers or televisions.
Correct.
So who is this actually getting to? Is it getting to the elites in Pyongyang? Is it like this small but middle class that lives in the capital? Like, I know it's hard to get data on it, but do you know anything about that?
No, but I mean, we know where the routes lie and where they connect. Look, very, very few North Koreans have access to a computer. Almost only the regime and students of the regime and people working for the regime. Some of the stuff that gets smuggled in does go directly to Pyongyang, where often it's like basically sent as a source file for distribution. So like a new movie will be smuggled in, and then somebody in Pyongyang will copy it and distribute it through their network there. So some of the stuff that gets smuggled in gets sent directly to the capital and to other large cities, where then it gets disseminated outwards. But the average North Korean is only either a step or two away from someone who owns a device that can play a video file off of a thumb drive, or for example a DVD. And these are these things called Notels, which are kind of like portable DVD players. And then also Chinese smartphones can play this stuff. They have USB ports and SD card ports. So you're always only a couple steps away for being able to watch this. So it's fairly mainstream and common. And an important thing to note is that the flash drive is not in and of itself illegal in North Korea. So this is how people share like photos of their wedding. So you got to trade. You want to share photos of your wedding with your father, so you put them on a flash drive and you bring them to them. I mean, flash drives are fairly ubiquitous, especially in urban areas.
Gotcha. I didn't know. That was another question I had, because I was worried that like they were going to outlaw flash drives, but I just don't think that was possible, given what you said, that everybody is kind of having them and transferring them and using them all the time. So
no, it's the content that's illegal. I mean, the regime itself uses, of course. I mean, the reason why so many people have televisions. One of the reasons why so many people have televisions in North Korea, even poorer people, is that the regime subsidizes them because they've wanted over the decades to inculcate them with their propaganda. So they'll set up television so that people can watch the state news, and so people can watch state films. There's a radio inside everybody's home that gets blasted into your home a couple times a day about the whereabouts of the great leader and what he's doing for everybody and what's happening.
Right. It made me think of East German kind of struggle against West Germany, and how having musicians playing, and how inside East Germany had to really fight and risk many times even hearing sort of music from the outside, right? So given that, do you think that the eventual goal of something like this is to eventually see a uprising of sorts? And I know you talked about that a little bit earlier with the sort of third tier, but I mean, if people really see how the outside world is, and given that they've been oppressed for this long, do you think that that's going to probably maybe be a natural outcome?
Well, I think we want to look at historical comparisons, right? So you can see on record across the last several decades that outside information has played a key role in the change and opening of very closed societies. So whether it be the Soviet Union or East Germany or Romania, there was a terrific documentary that's on Netflix now called Chuck Norris versus Communism, which it's fabulous. Your listeners should check it out. It's interviews with Romanians who talk about how dubbed Hollywood movies played a key role in their country's transformation to democracy.
Chuck Norris movies?
From Chuck Norris versus communism. Chuck Norris was one of many types of movie. I think it was just sort of a cute title for the film.
Gotcha.
How Hollywood movies aided and abetted that sort of evolution. All sorts of places around the world, different cultures where outside information and culture has led to change. Obviously, in the case of North Korea, the reason it's different is because the regime has been the most extreme in terms of its brutality and isolation. And yes, the answer is we're obviously looking for an end to this government. It's evil.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you about this. We look at the regime today, but it seemed like maybe during in late 90s, early 2000s. So this is the father of the current leader, that he had begun these small scale reforms with South Korea. It seemed there was less tension with South Korea, and there was these sort of free market zones where South Koreans companies could use and hire North Korean laborers and things like that. And I think we've seen a rolling back of that. Do you think that the current regime saw that as a threat, that the father was going down this sort of liberalizing perspective, and that was a danger to the regime, and so that's why he's reinforced the power of the military within Pyongyang versus, and I'm thinking about him killing, I think, his uncle.
So what's really important to understand is that the government of North Korea has always controlled its interactions with the outside world. So everything that it agreed to with regard to Kaesong, which is what you mentioned, which was the industrial center whereby North and South Koreans could interact while producing goods, that was all done because the North Korean government wanted to do it. It was because they could exploit something in the international system. The regime has been around for 7 decades because it's very clever and it knows how to survive. And it endlessly provokes and tries to scare the world so that we leave it alone. So it's the pattern of sending missiles is something that is very intentionally done with the goal of scaring us and basically making sure we leave them alone. And they're very good at doing this. Yeah. So everything that's been done in North Korea with regard to interactions with South Korea has all been controlled by the North Korean side. They've never really had to do something that they really didn't want to do. In fact, the South Korean government that presided over the Sunshine Policy, whereby Kim Dae-jung won the Nobel Peace Prize for bringing the Koreas together, this was exactly what the North Korean dictatorship wanted. It was actually a total lifeline. There was reports only years later that we found out that essentially Kim Dae-jung's administration bought this effort. They literally delivered hundreds of millions of dollars to the regime, which was at the time on the ropes. Yeah. So a lot of North Korean defectors actually say that the only reason the Kim regime is still around is because of Kim Dae-jung, and they think that his Nobel Peace Prize should be taken away.
Oh, wow. Because of his measures that he basically saved the North Korean regime. He
saved the North Korean regime with money.
And when was that?
Around the turn of the century. Just 2000, the early 2000s was the peak of the Sunshine period. So that's why people are afraid today of the new administration, which has a very similar philosophy to that particular administration. What unfortunately has happened is that the human rights of North Koreans have become politicized in South Korea. So the Progressive Party in South Korea will never stand up for the human rights of the North Korean people. So you'll never hear this current regime meeting defectors, and you'll never see the current president of South Korea seeking meetings with defectors and asking them what's going on, and how can he help them, and how can he get more information into North Korea. You won't see this. This is not something he's interested in. He'd much rather have engagement with the dictatorship in North Korea, which is very sad.
But do you think the reason for that sort of attitude is they're afraid to provoke the North Koreans into a conflict, being that Seoul is so close to the border with the North Koreans, and that might pose a threat, and that's why maybe some South Koreans are willing to sort of support a government that it has a softer stance towards North Korea? Or is it just that they just don't see the human rights perspective as that important?
I can't read their minds, unfortunately. Okay. It's puzzling and bizarre and sad and tragic.
Yeah.
Anyone who's concerned with the Korean people, their primary concern should be the human rights of the North Koreans. 99% of all violence committed on the Korean peninsula today is committed by the North Korean government against its people. We've got 250,000 people we're talking about in gulags and concentration camps, akin to what was going on with Stalin and Hitler, happening as you and I speak right now. So this is like a humanitarian emergency, but nobody cares. You'll never hear about it. You'll never hear about it. So I mean, it's being successfully hidden by the regime under all the bluster and propaganda and all the international media focus on the missiles and it's just, the South Korean government could care less.
And you said the estimate was what, 250,000?
It's a conservative estimate. It's probably more.
It's probably more, right?
So look, the reason why Flash Drives for Freedom exists and the reason why HRF has been focusing on sending information in it is because no one else is doing it.
I forgot, maybe you mentioned it. Like, how did the actual idea come about, if you don't mind me asking? Is that
at the Oslo Freedom Forum in 2009, which is this summit that we produce once a year where we bring together activists from all over the world, the North Koreans came to us and said, meaning the defectors and refugees came to us and said, why don't we think about doing something similar? They were already doing it anyway. It's just they were doing it on a tiny scale because they didn't have any resources. So about 5 years ago, we went to the border. We went to Seoul and we traveled to the border and we looked at what these groups were doing. And some of them were using radio and some of them were floating balloons with leaflets and flash drives and DVDs in to North Korea, and others were actually sending them over through China. And we realized what a great opportunity it was to try to increase their impact and connect them to people who could help. So we really started getting involved at that point. As far as like the Flash Drives for Freedom campaign, that was a collaboration between a Bay Area organization called Forum 280 and then later a company called USB Memory Direct that's been generously supporting the effort.
Very nice. Cool. How could somebody, if they're listening, help? Like if they want to send over flash drives?
Go to flashdrivesforfreedom.org. It's got instructions. I mean, we've got a P.O. box in Palo Alto, California. You can mail your stuff to. You can make donations to the effort, either to HRF or to some of our partner organizations who are led by North Korean refugees doing outstanding work. So you have the North Korea Strategy Center. You have the North Korea Intellectuals Solidarity. You have NOW, NAUH. You have No Chain. Got Fighters for a Free North Korea. You've got a whole constellation of North Korean defector-led organizations in South Korea doing excellent work.
Cool. Really quick, as we're kind of coming towards an end, I wanted to ask about the role of China. We hear a lot about that in the news. And what role do you think China is? Because while China is still this sort of authoritarian regime itself, it doesn't have the same type of restrictions. But can you talk a little bit about China and how they either have...
Sure. I mean, they absolutely are guilty of aiding and abetting this system. I mean, the Chinese dictatorship on its own is, when we just look at the Chinese dictatorship, it's probably the most, it is the largest dictatorship in the world and probably causes the most pure human suffering out of any other government, given how many people that it controls, and how many people are in its labor camps, and how many people it disappears and hides and tortures and kills. But that aside, we have to look at China's role with the North Korean situation.
Sure.
And one of the biggest problems is that when people escape from North Korea, if they get caught in China, they could get sent back to North Korea. It's called repatriation. What happens then is any North Korean returned to North Korea is viewed as a traitor and is either put in a prison camp, jailed, tortured, or killed.
Wow.
So if the Chinese government, if the Communist Party was willing to reverse its policy on this and instead simply deport any North Korean who they find to South Korea, which is willing to accept them, it would be a game changer. It would be one of the largest single steps that we could take towards the liberation of North Korea.
So it would take Donald Trump having China change the policy and have them repatriate them to South Korea.
I mean, defectors have told me that what they'd like to see Donald Trump do and other future U.S. presidents do is focus on two major things. A, send more information into North Korea, and that's something the U.S. government could obviously do. And B, go to the negotiating table and convince the Chinese to stop sending North Koreans back to North Korea.
And their whole family, if maybe people don't know this, but if somebody breaks the law in North Korea, is it correct that their entire family and generations of their family go into camps?
There's a guilty by association measure that the regime uses as a deterrent. So when you get in trouble, yes, extended members of your family also get in trouble. The number of generations obviously depends on, but yes, usually, like, for example, if someone gets into the prison camp, their parents and their children may go with them, or at a minimum get impacted, meaning they might lose their jobs, they might drop into a lower caste. One of the things that people don't know about North Korea is that much like India has a caste system, North Korea has an official state-sponsored caste system that has more than 50 different levels, which all depend on your loyalty to the regime. So broadly speaking, there's loyal, wavering, and disloyal. So if you're disloyal, the regime has geographically separated you out. So your loyalty determines who you can marry, where you can live, where you can study, where you can work. So if you're in one of the disloyal castes, you will be out in the hinterlands, out in the mountains, in the deserts, and that's where you're going to live. If you're loyal, you get to live in Pyongyang or one of the other major cities. So, to this subject of auto warm beer and tourism in North Korea, what people don't realize is that if they go to North Korea, you're only going to meet the 1%. Right. You're only going to meet the elite. So your chances of quote unquote making a difference are very minimal.
Right. And yet people still go, I guess, for tourism.
Terrible idea. I mean, think about it this way. If it was 1937 or something like that, would you and your friends want to go on vacation in Nazi Germany?
No, I wouldn't.
Right. But people think it's a cool idea to go to North Korea.
No, it's just a place of, I mean, I can't imagine. It almost feels like a prison, but in a state form, right? I mean, you're going to have a guide follow you. I've seen enough documentaries on Netflix.
I mean, all you're doing is participating in the state propaganda.
Yeah.
So if you want to give them hard currency and you want to come back with that wasn't so bad. Right. Because it's not going to be so bad. Because you're going to go to Pyongyang and you're going to hang out with the officials and they're going to take you to see some things. Right. They're not going to let you see anything that they don't want you to see.
Right.
And you're going to leave that trip by saying, obviously it was strange and bizarre and people acted kind of like robots and they weren't really emotional and they didn't really tell me much.
Right.
But it wasn't so bad.
Right.
I mean, that's what most people who go to North Korea as a tourist come back and say, which is like the farthest thing from the truth that's possible. It is so bad. It is so bad that it's, the worst human rights crisis in the whole world.
In the whole world.
So,
yeah.
No, it's horrific.
Yeah, it is.
So the lesson there is don't go to North Korea as a tourist. Learn more about North Korea. Read books about North Korea. There's some amazing books out there ranging from Dear Leader to Yeonmi Park's book to Hunso Lee's book, The Girl with Seven Names, to Barbara Demick, who works at the LA Times, wrote a beautiful book compiling the stories of defectors. There's many, many books you can get out there and read and get educated about this. The best book about this subject that we've talked about on this podcast is actually by Jian Beck, called North Korea's Hidden Revolution. Okay, and you can get it now, and you can learn about how information is the main way that we can challenge the Kim regime.
So what was the name again? North Korea's
Hidden Revolution.
Hidden Revolution. Okay. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us today. I really appreciate it. I learned a lot about it that I didn't know before.
Well, thanks so much for having me on, and check out href.org and Flash Drives for Freedom.
All right. We should. Thanks a lot, Alex. Have a good day.
All right. Take care.
All right.
Bye.
Take care. Bye.